Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first program to kick off our annual Black History Month celebration. My name is Chris Williams, and I'm the Assistant Director of the James Farmer Multicultural Center. We are pleased to have you this evening. This is our first event during this year's Black History Month, and we are excited, very excited to host this event with our fellow colleagues at the James Monroe Museum. We've developed a great partnership over the past 4 years, and now I'm going to pass it off to Mr. Scott Harris.
Thank you very much, Chris. I am Scott Harris. I'm Executive Director of Museums here at the University of Mary Washington. And we are so happy that one of our museums, the James Monroe Museum, is collaborating this evening with our colleagues at the James Farmer Multicultural Center on another program. We do want to acknowledge sponsors who make all of our museum's public programming possible: the Community Foundation of the Rappahannock River region, the Paul and Jane Jones Trust, which our friend Walter Sheffield is the trustee for that, the Truist Wealth organization that has taken over the Stewart Jones Trust for us, and the Friends of the James Monroe Museum. We greatly appreciate the support of all these folks for the public programs of our museum. We do want to remind the participants in the webinar tonight that you can pose questions to our speaker using the Q&A tab, and just type those in, and Lindsay Crawford, our public programs coordinator, who's working the board for us, will come on later after the presentation and be able to pose those questions to our speaker. We're really happy that in addition to members of the general public joining us this evening, we have students from both University of Mary Washington and University of Iowa. So we're making a wonderful, almost transcontinental educational experience here with our students. In 1773, a poem was published in Boston that celebrated the work of an artist living in that city, and it began like this: to show the laboring bosom's deep intent, and thought and living characters to paint, when first thy pencil did those beauties give, and breathing figures learnt from thee to live, how did those prospects give my soul delight, a new creation rushing on my sight. Still wondrous youth, each noble path pursue, on deathless glories fix thine ardent view. Still may the painters and the poets fire, to aid thy pencil and thy verse conspire. The author of the poem and its subject were extraordinary in that time because they were enslaved African Americans. Scipio Moorhead's artistic talents were extolled in To S.M., a young African painter, on seeing his works. The poet, Phillis Wheatley, is the subject of tonight's presentation. Dr. Tara Bynum is an assistant professor of English and African American studies and a scholar of early African American literary histories before 1800. She received her PhD in English from Johns Hopkins University and a BA in political science from Barnard College. Her current monograph, Reading Pleasures, which will be published by the University of Illinois Press's New Black Studies program this fall, examines the ways in which 18th century enslaved and/or free men and women feel good or experience pleasure in spite of the privations of slavery, unfreedom, or white supremacy. It is a pleasure that isn't beholden to social expectations or systemic oppression, but instead is experienced because of an individual's commitment to religious faith, friendship, or community building. This work of Dr. Bynum's is part of a larger ongoing project that thinks more deeply about how Black communities in the early republic made and shaped the very meaning of nation building in the greater New England area and also beyond. Dr. Bynum's research and writing have been sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Antiquarian Society, the Library Company of Philadelphia, Rutgers University, the University of Pennsylvania's McNeil Center for Early American Studies, and the College of Charleston. Her essays have appeared in Commonplace, Legacy, J19, Criticism, and American periodicals. Dr. Bynum, we are so happy to welcome you virtually to the University of Mary Washington.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's joined me this evening for this conversation, and in particular, the good people at the James Monroe Museum and Memorial Library, the James Farmer Multicultural Center, and the University of Mary Washington. Of course, I'm most especially grateful for Lindsay Crawford, Scott Harris, and Chris Williams. So with that said, let me share my screen. All right, and y'all can hear me, right? I think I'm unmuted.
You're good.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So first and foremost, let me set the scene. Picture this, it's an evening in February, not wholly unfamiliar to us because it's the third evening in February right now. And Phillis Wheatley is walking down the street in Providence, Rhode Island with an acquaintance. His name is Mr. Kwamina, and as they walk together, they pass by Mr. Zingo. Wheatley remembers her agreeable but cold walk with Mr. Kwamina and this wintry day in an unpublished, albeit extant letter to her friend, Uber Tanner. Tanner is living in Newport, Rhode Island. The busy port town is less than a day's ride from Providence. Both women, about 20-something years old, share letters often, and they talk about all sorts of things: God, death, the sale of Wheatley's books, or the certainty of their religious faith. This letter is dated February 14th, 1776, and in it, Wheatley acknowledges receipt of Tanner's kind note of the 17th ultimo, though she admits that she isn't there to receive it when Cato Cogshaw drops it off. Let me say, take note of the 5 names that you've got to remember as I move through this. So there's Phillis Wheatley, of course, Uber Tanner, her friend, Cato Cogshaw, John Kwamina, also known as Mr. Kwamina, and Zingo Stevens, also known as Mr. Zingo. So it's been about a month since Tanner has written to Wheatley. When Cato Cogshaw carries Tanner's letter to Wheatley, there are British warships blockading Newport's harbor. The blockade has nearly stopped all trade, and the soldiers have terrorized the town and its residents. By January 1776, less than a quarter of the town's population still lives there because the rest have fled. When Wheatley responds to her friend in the midst of this wartime fervor, just 5 months before the colony's rebels declare their independence from England, and about 2 months after Lord Dunmore's proclamation, and it shows, Wheatley calls herself a mere spectator, and in the way of a spectator, she bears witness to and sits in judgment of unspecified wartime events in vague and aspirational terms. And there may be too many to name: the Battle of Quebec, the burning of Norfolk and Bunker Hill, the steady march of troops through nearby towns and cities, or the overwhelming angst of the ever-approaching war. She confesses to her anxious suspense concerning the fortune of this unnatural civil unrest, and she chastises, though she doesn't name either, those actions that bear the appearance of greater barbarity than that of the uncivilized part of mankind. Maybe she means the barbarity of quartering soldiers, the ever-present specter of violence, or the certainty of death. The newspapers, like the Providence Gazette for sure, note the casualties alongside the memoranda from Britain. No one doubts the barbarity of this war, and Wheatley laments her friend's extremely unhappy situation. Nevertheless, together, Wheatley and Tanner seemingly and with wonder exclaim on the proceedings of nations that are favored with the divine revelation of the gospel, as Wheatley writes. She lives out this exclamation in Providence because this unnatural civil unrest has made her a refugee. Boston, her American hometown, is under siege. And since the summer of 1775, Boston's residents, over 10,000, have sought refuge in neighboring and far off towns, villages, and elsewhere. By the year's end, British soldiers will return and occupy Tannerstown again, and she'll eventually have to make her way to Worcester, Massachusetts. Despite its brevity, Wheatley's letter has a lot to say about what she sees as the, quote, ambition and thirst for dominion. Surely her letter carries the burden of uncertainty. What seems ambivalent about whose ambition or whose thirst she condemns or supports. It's not particularly clear what side of the loyalist patriot aisle Wheatley is on. She doesn't seem to admit for whom she's rooting. Just 3 years before, she has her poems attestation signed by Tories and rebel patriots alike. But in this letter, what seems most certain is her closing prayer. But let us leave the event to him whose wisdom alone can bring good out of evil, and he is infinitely more superior to all the craftiness of the enemies of this seemingly devoted country. Wheatley has no doubt in her God's infinite wisdom, and her prayer strives to offer comfort to her friend, herself, and this us. She prays on behalf of this us, and obviously it's an us that includes Tanner and herself. But this letter, I'd argue, and will argue, puts Wheatley and Tanner among a larger us. And it seems fitting for Wheatley to share this wartime prayer too, on behalf of her letter's greater community, her walking buddy, Mr. Kwamina, their mutual acquaintance, Mr. Zingo, and her letter's carrier, Cato Coggeshall. On this February day, Wheatley remembers, for those of us who live in the 21st century, that she is living as a refugee among a community of artisans, friends, and neighbors. She and Tanner share in this community with persons who live and risk travel between Boston, Providence, Newport, and elsewhere. Even though it's fun for me to imagine where Wheatley, Mr. Zingo, and Mr. Kwamina are walking or the conversation, or wonder sometimes if they carry their lanterns with them, her letter can't help but to remember that each of them is living through this war. It's the same war that will compel a young teenage James Monroe into military service. It's the same war that will make household names of several more Virginians. You already know them: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and the list is far longer. I'll stop there for brevity's sake. What's left unsaid in our present day version of history is that the Revolutionary War was not just experienced by youngish white men. I asked my students once, not the Iowa ones yet, but some other ones in the past, if they'd ever thought of Black women when they imagined the Revolutionary War. And of course they looked at me puzzled and admitted that they never do. So when we read Wheatley's letters, what we share in is the experience of this war as it's lived by two Black women and their friends. And when we read Wheatley's prayer in particular, what we hear is a prayer that is meant to strengthen her friend, herself, and this us, Mr. Zingo, Mr. Kwamina, and Cato Coggeshall, as each navigates their wartime living. So even though Wheatley sees them in Providence, Mr. Zingo, Mr. Kwamina, and Cato Coggeshall live at times in Newport, and they worship together or near one another at Second Congregational Church, or just under a mile away at First Congregational Church. They're a bit older than Wheatley. Mr. Zingo is a father, and he's a husband to Phyllis Linden first, and then Elizabeth, and eventually Violet. By 1776, he said he's had several children: Pompey, Sarah, Charles, and he's buried a son, Prince. He's worked in John Stevens' stone carving shop while enslaved to the Stevens family. Mr. Kwamina, or John Kwamina, is married to a cake baker named Duchess, and together they are parents to Catherine, Charles, and Cynthia. Wheatley has known him at least since Tanner's and John Kwamina's and Cato Coggeshall's pastor 3 years before makes mention of him as part of an effort to send missionaries to Reverend Philip Quaker in West Africa. Their pastor, Reverend Hopkins, of First Congregational Church, hopes to entice Wheatley to join his missionary efforts back in 1773. Though Wheatley declined the invitation, Kwamina in Bristol, Yama, another acquaintance, is sent off to the College of New Jersey to learn to be a missionary. The colonial troubles with Britain eventually thwart Kwamina's mission and missionary education. and he will make his wife, Duchess, a widow just 3 years after Wheatley's letter in 1779 when he's killed aboard a privateer. Cato Cogshall is a distiller, a father, and he's enslaved to Nathaniel Deacon Cogshall. He is kin, fictive or imagined, to Bristol Yama, who I mentioned before, who, along with Mr. Kwamina, participates in Reverend Hopkins' forestalled missionary work. So what I mean to suggest is that these men in Wheatley and Tanner too know each other. They share pastors, they cross paths on the same street, and their slave owners or enslavers may be family. For each of them, Mr. Zingo, Mr. Kwamina, and Cato Cogshall and Uber Tanner, Wheatley is a friend, an acquaintance, and an occasional walking partner. Altogether, these women and men gather in Wheatley's letter as they do in person, in conversation, in worship, or in prayer. And my punchline is a simple one. Wheatley is not alone. And it's so easy to imagine Wheatley as alone because if you Google her right now, right this second, what'll come up under images in that Google search is a picture of Wheatley by herself in the frontispiece of her poems. But to read Wheatley's letters to glimpse a series of interactions, not only between acquaintances or friends, but also between enslaved or used to be enslaved persons as they live, love, work, and are displaced further during a war. Wheatley's interlocutors have made a community even as they're living, as this war requires their mobility. And what they make real together are their varying degrees of relationship, friendship, while having to anticipate the war's everyday disruptions. Because of the disorienting way of this civil contest, they live out their shared stories and correspondence as line items in lists and in meeting minutes. Theirs is a community that is best remembered in manuscripts rather than in print. I suspect it was never meant to make it to a printer's press or a library's catalog. This is a letter for friends, between and among friends who are willing to risk the loss of a letter or worse, an unwelcome set of wandering eyes. It's how friends speak to each other when they are too far apart to see each other or to laugh or feel together in person. See, what is easily remembered among friends is how this community, of which they are a part in Newport and Providence, cares and tends to each other and to its people. Wheatley's prayer with its us admits to the kind of tending that, to borrow from political theorist Sheldon Wolin, quote, implies active care of things close at hand, not mere solicitude, unquote. To tend is to care for those who are thought to be close at hand, who are part of the community. To tend, it presupposes a belonging, a shared language, and a collective way to make meaning because it's not necessarily meant for everyone. It presumes a neighborliness between persons who tend to each other. Literary historian Derek Spires uses neighborliness to name a certain kind of shared civic responsibility that is robust enough to promote mutual responsibility, yet open enough to promote more democratic engagement. To be neighborly is to have a real sensibility, as Philadelphia's famed AME church founder Richard Allen calls it, or a willingness to feel on behalf of another in real ways. Real, Spires suggests, is only possible when this sensibility produces measures to alleviate the need, that produces an affective response, such as caring or attending for a neighbor. This sensibility is made real when neighbors look out for each other. So when Wheatley remembers in this February letter just how she and her neighbors Tanner, Kwamina, Cogshall, and Zingo Stevens look out for each other. This neighborliness and its tending is the kind that shares walks and secrets in person and in well-kept manuscripts. There's tending in Wheatley's penmanship. Consider she's secured a quill, ink, and enough paper, even as Britain's ships have blocked the steady flow of all manner of goods and services. It's with care, with just enough pressure that the ink hasn't even yet bled through the paper some, I guess almost 250 years later, that she writes her words and signs her name. And this isn't the best one, but Phillis Wheatley has a fantastic signature. It's in the delivery of her letters and Tanner's too, and the guarantee of their arrival. It's worth mentioning that Cato Cogshall makes it to Wheatley's Providence home. He tends to her mail and he ensures its rightful delivery. Even though she isn't there to greet him, Tanner's letter makes it to her. maybe it's left for her, or maybe there's someone to hand it to her. Their neighborliness and the care that comes with it is in every part of this letter. It's certainly in the few names that she chooses to remember to her friend. And to tend is what neighbors do for each other. Tending demonstrates one's worthiness as well as acknowledges the worthiness of someone else. And it seems for Wheatley and her friends, her acquaintances, her neighbors, a way to determine just what she and her prayers us mean to each other. So Wheatley will live for another 8 years or so after she sends this letter to Uber Tanner. In those 8 years, the war will end and she'll marry John Peters, and she will die when she's about 31 years old. The circumstances of her death are still not clear. Her death happens about a year after the war's end and after yet another Treaty of Paris. But what this new country looks like is still to be determined. Wheatley's interlocutors, Mr. Zingo, Cato Cogshall, and Uber Tanner, keep living in and around Newport or Providence. Their living and how they tend to each other shows up in remaining and extant records, such as the list of the Free African Union Society's members, in someone's earliest memories of Newport, in gravestones at the Common Burial Ground, and as part of well-kept records keeping. Mr. Zingo and Cato Cogshall helped to found the Free African Union Society. Wheatley's Us doesn't begin or end on February 14th, 1776. And this is the moral of the story. There's a community here. It's a community of neighbors who are part of a variety of neighborly communities, and together they tend to each other, they care for, and they care for each other. Thank you.
So as we kind of get ourselves back on the screen, get our Brady Bunch view back here, Dr. Bynum, thank you for that that sort of focused look of what that community that Phillis Wheatley was a part of in that point in the war was like, to give us a snapshot, you might say. As you observed, both Phillis Wheatley and James Monroe were inspired by the ideals of the American Revolution. They were, as our audience may not know, roughly contemporaries in age at the start. I believe her birth predicted around or suspected around 1753, 54, in that time period, 1758 for Monroe. And so the first several decades of their lives were lived more or less at the same time and in these same circumstances. But even though they had that shared inspiration of the revolution, even though they both encountered and had great respect for George Washington, they didn't interact with each other directly that we know of, and you really could not say that they belonged to a community despite having some of these things in common. So I wonder, the sense of community that you're describing there in Newport and Providence, did it cross racial or societal lines? Did it approach something like, on the part of whites to Wheatley and other blacks, the beginnings of a sense of equality, or at least an acknowledgement of their humanity?
That's a great and interesting question. And I'll say that what I find interesting about it is really the set of assumptions that it makes. So first, I'd say that it assumes that a community runs in part in relation to equality. And I don't think that I would make communities in and of themselves inherently equal. Second, I think that there's an assumption that there's not an acknowledgement of Black humanity at this particular time in US history. But here's what I've learned. Community doesn't require equality, but it does, I would argue, presume humanity. And I think I've learned, kind of traveling through 18th century primary sources, that slavery or the enslavement of people only works if you understand them to be people. And I know that, you know, dehumanization is like how we often frame the experiences of Black people. But I think that the horrors of enslavement happen because it's person to person. And because there are two people wherein one person like kind of can't get away from the other person's humanity and is trying to control it in horrific ways, but still in ways that have to acknowledge that person's humanity. So I guess the real takeaway of what I'm trying to say is that people can and sometimes suck, and they treat each other horribly because they live together in a community. So all manner of space, churches, marketplaces, sidewalks, houses, synagogues are shared in Newport. And to kind of go to the historic part of Newport, Rhode Island, you realize that like it's things are tight together. You know, the streets are relatively narrow, the houses are close together. So there's no way to not be interactive. So if I use the example of Zingo Stevens, who as I said, is enslaved to John Stevens, you know, John Stevens has to be aware of Zingo Stevens' humanity because it's Zingo Stevens that kind of has to carve the ornate images into the headstones at the Newport Common Burial Ground. Like, he knows Zingo can't be a cow because cows can't do that, you know? And Zingo later he keeps living into the 19th century and he buys property. He's part of the social fabric of the town, and he's part of it enough to know, and this is kind of the paradox that I'm hoping to get at, he's part of the community enough to know how important the creation of the Free African Union Society is to the Black community at the close of the Revolutionary War. Equality, I would say, doesn't make community in Newport, but there's a real need to have interactions across racial lines. So there's the white Christian community, there's a Jewish community, there's the indigenous community, there's the Black community, enslaved and free, and all of them have to make the business of living work in Newport, Rhode Island. So in short, I'd say that proximity in the everyday business of living and working together is what has people treat each other well. It's what has people treat each other cruelly. It also, you know, kind of, yeah, makes for the story, I'd say.
So I have a question. For the 31 years Phillis Wheatley lived in the 18th century, she was considered a singular figure as a Black woman poet. We've never considered that another Black woman could have been communicating and writing in the same way here in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Their realities could have been drastically different or surprisingly similar, but we will never know because of the lack of documentation in colonial Virginia for enslaved or, in rare circumstance, freed Black women. With this in mind, how did her influence as a writer endure and inspire other Black women and men writers in describing their experience in truth in this country?
So I should first say, pardon my lack of knowledge about Virginia's particular history in the 18th century. But here's what I wonder, or maybe what it is that I assume the fun part of this work is going to special collections, libraries, and digging around in them, or maybe, you know, kind of taking a shortcut and hitting up a digitized database like Hathi Trust or the Evans digital database. The search is inevitably guided by keywords or by the metadata. I think it's the right word. The librarians and archivists can let me know if I have misspoken. That ultimately helps organize all the stuff and make it findable. And Wheatley is easy to find because she ends up in the literary canon. Her letters, you know, what I'm obsessed with about Wheatley, are easy to find because they've been gathered and published in various editions of her complete writings. But without those collected and published writings, we'd have to know where to go, which historical societies, which personal libraries to visit. So I kind of start in that somewhat meandering way, because I bet that there are writings somewhere, and this is where I'm, you know, kind of disappointed in my lack of knowledge, maybe even some that are well cataloged at their particular historical society, but they haven't made it into view for the right kind of scholar to talk about or to dig up. But I think that what Wheatley's letter does for me, and that correspondence with Uber Tanner, is that it reminds me that it's important to remember the possibility that something is there. It's just that where it is either not yet known or not yet known to me or to us in particular, because I or we haven't done the work to read about them. So I guess what I'm in this long-winded way trying to say is that there might be writings by 18th century Black women in Fredericksburg. I just haven't come across them, or we haven't come across them. But there's somebody who will watch this YouTube and be like, they're at our historical society. We've been waiting for somebody to come see them. So let me just say that as a caveat. So to the actual question, Wheatley has been so influential for centuries, and it's because folks love or don't love her poems. She's understood to be the first in African-American literature's origin story, though I might debate whether there is actually a singular origin story. I'd say it's a bit more complex than that. Jupiter Hammond writes about Wheatley in 1778, and Jupiter Hammond, is also a poet that has been writing. Uber Tanner helps to sell her poetry in Newport. There are countless examples of this influence. If we had to think of something a bit more contemporary, you've got poets June Jordan, Lucille Clifton, writers Alice Walker and Audre Lorde celebrating Wheatley's legacy at the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Fest in 1979. Her name is currently misspelled on a t-shirt at Target right now for Black History Month. Shout out to Target for the misspelling of Phillis Wheatley's name. It seems impossible to kind of quantify Wheatley's influence. And I think the part of the question that I guess leads me to my own wondering is, kind of what makes Wheatley continue to be, the go-to when it's also clear that there are so many others that could be. There's James Albert Ukasa, there's Jupiter Hammond, there's, I guess Equiano gets some shine sometimes if we want to cross the pond, so yeah, I definitely think that Wheatley's influence is very well documented across time, geography.
I'll invite Lindsay Crawford to pop in here if she can do so technically to relay some of the questions we've been getting. And I will continue to speak in a slow, stalling manner until she can appear. There she is. Okay.
Hi, sorry, I've been having some technical problems. Hi, so it's been great hearing the conversation so far. We have some questions rolling in here. The first one I would like to bring up is from L. Murphy. The question is, why do you think historians are trying to erase by not talking about Wheatley's community?
I don't know if historians are trying to erase Wheatley's community. And I should shout out Elle. Elle is currently in my class. Shout out to you, Elle. I think that in the way of so much that happens when it comes to scholarship, so much is driven by what people are interested in. And I think that can be deeply personal, so I am interested in Wheatley's community in Newport. That's not to say that she doesn't have a community in Boston. And, that's not to say that she doesn't have communities all over the place. But my research isn't going to focus on anything other than Newport, Rhode Island right now, to be honest. And so I think that what I'm doing is not erasing so much as it is like hyper-focused. And I think that the beauty of the hyper-focus is that if you are ever trapped in an elevator with me and need something to talk about, and you're like, how about Phillis Wheatley in Newport, Rhode Island? I can go and go and go. But it can then look like that's the only kind of community that Wheatley has. So I guess I don't want to suggest that there's been an erasure, but I do think that I think history is so much motivated by what individual historians are interested in and what they find important. And then once their ideas and their storytelling is out in the world, the kind of next influencer is the audience. So then it becomes what the audience is interested in. The audience is always interested on being brought from Africa to America, that one particular poem. So I guess my goal is to kind of get the audience interested in something else if I can.
Great, great. So another question we have is, why do you think it's important for us in modern day to remember that Black enslaved people were present and interacted with their larger communities despite, or as you pointed out, alongside daily cruelties and inequalities?
Because I think we got to remember that, you know, Black people are complex and curious and engaged residents of the United States of America, or what becomes the United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think that certainly after teaching African-American literature at various institutions, you know, I think that, you know, as time passes on, it has, you know, I have to convince students that, like, you know, when all my students were born in 1990, it's like, Black people didn't just start doing stuff in 1990, you know, and now that my students are born in the 21st century, like, Black people were doing stuff before 2001, you know, and I think that something tricky happens when it comes to the Black community in particular, though it's not necessarily just the Black community, but since that's who we're talking about, I think that there's like a way in which, you know, Black people aren't imagined to be doing things. And I think if I can just speak kind of very self-centeredly, like, it dawned on me at some point that the way that students sometimes were talking about the Black community, even sometimes the way that scholarship was talking about the Black community, I as a Black person could not recognize myself in that work, you know? So if, you know, now that I'm getting older in relation to the students, like, having them imagine that, you know, because I wasn't born in the 21st century, I was born in the 20th, that I might have a certain kind of hardship and burden and downtroddenness. It's like, well, I mean, I'm human, that happens, but my life hasn't inherently sucked because I'm a Black woman. And it hasn't inherently sucked because I'm a Black woman born in the 20th century. And I think that for all the generations that I've met, I think that they too would be like, how you gonna decide that because I was born in 1952, my life had to suck, or because I was born in 1918, like my grandmother, my life had to suck, you know? So I think, I guess that's why it's important for me to do the work that I do from the angle that I do it, because I wanted to see what feels familiar.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And going off of that, someone asked the question, why are positive stories about Black people in the 18th century, like Phillis Wheatley's friendship with Tanner, ignored in our modern understanding and studies of the time period? Why do we hear that it mostly focuses on the negative, as you were bringing up?
Yeah, I think it's because it's the expected story. And I also think that because I'm talking about enslaved people, I'm talking about slavery, I think that sometimes people have questioned whether or not I'm trying to make an argument about happy slaves. I'm like, no, I'm not trying to make an argument about happy slaves at all. I think what I am trying to do is demonstrate the ways that Black people and Black women in particular have figured out how to keep living. And also kind of acknowledge the fact that there are spaces where Black people are not necessarily thinking about white people. They're not thinking about systemic oppression. They're not kind of engaged with the fight at that particular moment in time, you know? So even if Wheatley and Obertanner have a critique of slavery and its business in Rhode Island or elsewhere, I think this particular letter is still, to me, just about, you know, sitting with a friend who is living in a town that's getting blasted by British troops. But there's still kind of time to walk down the street with, you know, I always bring this up, Wheatley's walking down the street with somebody else's husband. I've got questions about that. I don't have answers, I just got questions. Yeah, so.
Got you, thank you. Someone going off of that, when we were talking about Phillis Wheatley and her experience as a writer and just in the community in general, someone asked if Wheatley was subjected to individuals trying to verify that it was her poems. If she dealt with anything, the person brought up that she's heard of this happening in history before, where people are questioning whether or not Phillis Wheatley was the poet who published her poetry and everything like that. Have you come across anything like that? What's your experience with that?
So I think that there were a lot of folks that questioned Wheatley's ability to write poems. You know, I think we all spoke at some point about Thomas Jefferson and the Notes on the State of Virginia, and his, oh wait, Scott, you're muted. Okay, so I think that there are, I think there are examples of the way that Wheatley was doubted. I think there are also examples of the way that Wheatley was affirmed in her ability to write poems. I will say what interests me most are Wheatley's letters, and I don't think that there's been because they are interpersonal correspondence. You know, I think that there hasn't been a question about whether or not Wheatley could write letters. You know, and I definitely I'm really not interested in her poems.
Right,
like
right.
I really am trying to argue, like, let's get to these letters, guys. Let's get to let's figure out what the letters are saying.
Well, oddly enough, Thomas Jefferson was not interested in her poem. Sorry for my technical problem earlier.
But he kind of was. That's the thing.
Well, it's interesting though. Chris and I batted the same general question around a couple different ways. So I've tried to blend both of our thoughts on this because it's very striking. You know, Phillis Wheatley did receive a certain amount of renown for her poetry among, you know, literate white audiences at the time she was writing. And in his 1781 book, Notes on the State of Virginia, a famous work of Jefferson's, where he talks, you know, he just shows how smart he is, talking about a little bit of everything. But he really denigrated the intellect and the accomplishments, not only of Phillis Wheatley, but basically any Black poet. A few others, or at least one other he mentioned by name. And he said, misery is often the parent of the most affecting touches in poetry. Among the Blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. And then he mangles her name. Religion indeed has produced a Phillis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. The compositions published under her name are below the dignity of criticism. He felt compelled to not only dismiss, but to actually really attack and denigrate Wheatley. And I can't help but wonder if this is almost a way of acknowledging how well she was received by other whites, and he felt he had to try and knock that down. And Chris is wondering, you know, can we draw some comparison between that kind of attitude and approach to the ways in which Black women are subjected to some of the same tropes in society today, especially ones who are in the public eye?
Well, I think what's funny though, is that Jefferson critiques Wheatley, you know? So right. I think that Jefferson's take on Wheatley is an interesting one. It, I would say, admits to the perpetual tension that exists between racist assumptions and the real certainty of Black intelligence and creativity. So Wheatley is noteworthy enough to write about in Notes on the State of Virginia, which is published, to my knowledge, after Wheatley's death. So the woman is gone. She's passed on, and Thomas Jefferson is talking about her. So that seems like it's worth noting. And he says that she's below the dignity of criticism. but he criticizes her.
Yes,
He offers
exactly.
a critique. He offers a reading of Wheatley. And even if we would debate his reading, even if we would say like, what does it even mean that religion has produced a Phillis Wheatley, but it couldn't produce a poet? Like we could have that discussion, but that is a reading. That's a way of understanding Wheatley's poetry. So he places Wheatley at the level of criticism. He gives the reader a reading of Wheatley's poetry. And it seems to me that Jefferson has the longstanding problem that most racists do. It's hard to sit with a lie when the truth is so nearby and it's so evident. So, you know, I think that's the tricky part. And I think it's also the thing that brings us to the 21st century when it comes to racism, because racism is many things, but it consistently lacks creativity. So like,
Right.
Okay, Jefferson, she's not worth the criticism, but then you take time in your own book to give her the space in your own book. Like, what? Doesn't make good sense. And the other interesting thing too is, you know, they hadn't figured out how to commit to standardized spellings just yet. So maybe he butchered her name, or maybe he's just an 18th century somebody who's like, I don't know how to spell real good. I'm gonna just sound it out. One fun thing is that, like, I think we say Wheatley and it looks like wheat, L-E-Y, but I think that if we were in the 18th century, it might have sounded a little bit more like Whatley. You know, my British English doesn't exist, so I don't know exactly what it would have sounded like, but you know, I think that there's a space for the phonetic pronunciation is all I need to suggest.
We had another question that kind of sparked an interest of what got you involved with working with her letters, and how do you think people could, you know, in education or in the public eye, instead of just focusing on her poetry, like expand upon her letters and in this, and what would you, I know you teach a whole class on this, but kind of what, you know, shifting the, you know, the perspective a little bit when doing that. You feel like it's a disservice just to teach about poetry is part of the question. And so I'll hand that off to you.
So I think a funny thing happened. I encountered Wheatley's poems in depth in graduate school, the class that I took with Dr. Michael Moon, who now is at Emory University. And, you know, I think that there was like a number of interesting things that kind of caught my eye about the poems. And I think that there were a number of interesting things that caught my eye about the poems that had me think about this idea of pleasure in ways that I never had when it came to 18th century Black people. But another funny thing happened, and that was I kind of went to the back of the completed writings, the Penguin edition, I think edited by Vincent Coretta, and realized that there was letters back there. And you should know about the complete writings. They are really easy to get. So it's not like I had to, I don't know, special order them from some hard to get place. Like at the time, I could go into a Barnes and Noble, get the complete writings. We can go to Amazon right now and get the complete writings. And, you know, I think that once I went to the back of the Penguin edition and entered into this world, you know, I think I was presented with a whole new and different way to understand Wheatley. And when I realized that those letters included correspondence with another Black woman, I was like, what am I doing? Why am I reading these poems? I should be reading these letters. And I guess I should also shout out Catherine Clay-Bissard, whose book, Spiritual Interrogations, is what led me to the relationship between Uber Tanner and Phillis Wheatley. So that's what kind of got me there. And there's also, you know, we always are looking for our shtick in the academy. There just has not been a lot of writing about the letters. So there was a, you know, I had a hook. I had a thing that wasn't necessarily being done and redone and done again. You know, another essay on being brought from Africa to America would not have been as exciting as realizing that there were Black women's writing communities in 18th century New England, as Catherine Clay-Bissard would have us kind of return to.
Which is funny, interesting, because someone actually proposed a question of what is the impact of these letters and poems on how we understand Black women's joy, plight at the time period? Can parallels be drawn between Black women's lives then and today?
I definitely think so. It's funny. There are a couple other students that I saw from my class. There's Stevie, Josie, and there's somebody else. Oh my God, I closed my box. Anyways, maybe Sarah. I showed in class a probate show. Sigma Gamma Rho at Kennesaw State University, they were kind of crossing. And I've taken to showing what probably feels like really random videos to my students at the start of class. And the reason that I showed it on the day that we talked about Phillis Wheatley was because I wanted us to think about a much longer history of Black women trying to and doing, creating communities of care, to use a very kind of recent bit of language. So I can't say that Black sororities were founded by Uber Tanner and Phillis Wheatley. That's not what I mean to suggest. But I guess I showed that video in order to kind of highlight the fact that there's been this long-standing history of Black women and Black women's friendships, and Black women's friendships that are very intentional about how they care for one another. So what's interesting about Uber Tanner is that after Phillis Wheatley dies, Uber Tanner lives until 1835, I think. And I want to say it's in the 1810s that she helps to found a women's auxiliary organization. So the Free African Union Society is for the men, though women can participate or benefit from the Free African Union Society. But by the 1810s, the women start their auxiliary organization. So I think about like the Wheatley and Uber Tanner letters as kind of one part of that history of Black women's community. And then thinking about, Uber Tanner helping to found and preside over this women's auxiliary organization in Newport in the 19th century. And then, it suddenly doesn't seem inconceivable that you get to the development of, yet another iteration of Black women's organizations. So I think that that's why and how I understand this particular story to be important. And I guess I want to emphasize, to kind of return to the point that I was making earlier in response to Chris's question. I think of Wheatley and Tanner as just one example of this. So I don't want to suggest that there's like a very direct and linear arc, but instead they are one example.
Yeah, I appreciate your perspective. And it seems like that is all the questions we have. We had quite a few. Chris, Scott, do you have any last minute things?
No, on my part, speaking for the museum, we're so glad we could have this interaction with Dr. Bynum and go in a direction that takes us a little bit outside the normal James Monroe comfort zone, which we've said we want to do life and times, as well as always doing things just on Monroe. I'd love to say that we knew Monroe had heard of her work. We don't have evidence of that, but he certainly had the opportunity. And so maybe some little part of our brain, we can think, well, maybe he did read it and had a better opinion of her than Jefferson. We'll never know. But it's certainly great that we've been able, again, to collaborate, as we say, with the Multicultural Center and to see students from both of our schools a part of this. So thank you on our part for the museum to everybody for making this happen.
Perfect. Chris, do you have any last minute?
Yeah, I just want to copy and paste Scott's comments. I also wanted to just say thank you to Dr. Bynum for sharing her expertise and light with us this evening. Our partnership with the James Monroe Museum has been a fruitful one, And to work with you all on this particular program has been a joy for me, with the countless meetings we've had and the great enthralling conversations we've had as well. And on behalf of the James Farmer Multicultural Center, we'd like to thank Dr. Bynum and the James Farmer Museum for continued partnership and for delivering another great program this evening to help kick off our 2022 Black History Month celebration.
And Dr. Bynum, any last words?
Oh my goodness, just thank you. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the space to have me nerd out on Phillis Wheatley and Uber Tanner. You know, I think that any opportunity to do that, I absolutely welcome. So I am grateful to have had the opportunity to gather in our many meetings and also to, you know, kind of spend time with this audience that has been engaged. Yeah, it was just really exciting and thrilling. So I'm so appreciative. Thanks to all of you.
Well, thank you all so much. Everyone else, thank you for joining us virtually today. As someone said, if I had to choose anyone to be stuck on an elevator with, Dr. Bynum would be it. I would have to agree. This was an amazing conversation. I hope everyone has a great night, and I will see you later.